Chapter 10. A few minutes afterwards, the three hunters were seated before a sparkling fire. Beside them sat Cyrus Smith and the reporter. Pencroff looked from one to the other without saying a word, his cabi in his hand. "Yes, my good fellow," said the reporter, "a fire, a real fire, that will roast your game to a turn." "But who lighted it?" said the sailor. "The sun." The sailor could not believe his eyes, and was too stupefied to question the engineer. "Had you a burning glass, sir?" asked Herbert of Cyrus Smith. "No, my boy," said he, "but I made one." And he showed his extemporized lens. It was simply the two glasses, from his own watch and the reporter's, which he had taken out, filled with water, and stuck together at the edges with a little clay. Thus he had made a veritable burning glass, and by concentrating the solar rays on some dry moss had set it on fire. The sailor examined the lens, then he looked at the engineer without saying a word, but his face spoke for him. If Smith was not a magician to him, he was certainly more than a man. At last his speech returned, and he said, "Put that down, Mr. Spilett, put that down in your book." "I have it down," said the reporter. Then, with the help of Neb, the sailor arranged the spit, and dressed the cabi for roasting, like a suckling pig, before the sparkling fire, by whose warmth, and by the restoration of the partitions, the chimneys had been rendered habitable. The engineer and his companion had made good use of their day. Smith had almost entirely recovered his strength, which he had tested by climbing the plateau above. From thence his eye, accustomed to measure heights and distances, had attentively examined the cone whose summit he proposed to reach on the morrow. The mountain, situated about 6 miles to the northwest, seemed to him to reach about 3,500 feet above the level of the sea, so that an observer posted at its summit could command a horizon of 50 miles at least. He hoped, therefore, for an easy solution of the urgent question, island or continent. They had a pleasant supper, and the meat of the cabi was proclaimed excellent. The sargassum and pistachio nuts completed the repast. But the engineer said little. He was planning for the next day. Once or twice Pencroff talked of some project for the future, but Smith shook his head. "Tomorrow," he said, "we will know how we are situated, and we can act accordingly." After supper, more armfuls of wood were thrown on the fire, and the party lay down to sleep. The morning found them fresh and eager for the expedition which was to settle their fate. Everything was ready. Enough was left of the cabi for 24 hours' provisions, and they hoped to replenish their stock on the way. They charred a little linen for tinder, as the watch glasses had been replaced, and flint abounded in this volcanic region. At 7:30 they left the chimneys, each with a stout cudgel. By Pencroff's advice, they took the route of the previous day, which was the shortest way to the mountain. They turned the southern angle, and followed the left bank of the river, leaving it where it bent to the southwest. They took the beaten path under the evergreens, and soon reached the northern border of the forest. The soil, flat and swampy, then dry and sandy, rose by a gradual slope towards the interior. Among the trees appeared a few shy animals, which rapidly took flight before Top. The engineer called his dog back. Later, perhaps, they might hunt, but now nothing could distract him from his great object. He observed neither the character of the ground nor its products. He was going straight for the top of the mountain. At 10 o'clock they were clear of the forest, and they halted for a while to observe the country. The mountain was composed of 2 cones. The first was truncated about 2,500 feet up, and supported by fantastic spurs, branching out like the talons of an immense claw, laid upon the ground. Between these spurs were narrow valleys, thick-set with trees, whose topmost foliage was level with the flat summit of the first cone. On the northeast side of the mountain, vegetation was more scanty, and the ground was seamed here and there, apparently with currents of lava. On the first cone lay a second, slightly rounded towards the summit. It lay somewhat across the other, like a huge hat cocked over the ear. The surface seemed utterly bare, with reddish rocks often protruding. The object of the expedition was to reach the top of this cone, and their best way was along the edge of the spurs. "We are in a volcanic country," said Cyrus Smith, as they began to climb, little by little, up the side of the spurs, whose winding summit would most readily bring them out upon the lower plateau. The ground was strewn with traces of igneous convulsion. Here and there lay blocks, debris of basalt, pumice stone, and obsidian. In isolated clumps rose some few of those conifers, which, some hundreds of feet lower, in the narrow gorges, formed a gigantic thicket, impenetrable to the sun. As they climbed these lower slopes, Herbert called attention to the recent marks of huge paws and hoofs on the ground. "These brutes will make a fight for their territory," said Pencroff. "Oh well," said the reporter, who had hunted tigers in India and lions in Africa, "we shall contrive to get rid of them. In the meanwhile, we must be on our guard." While talking they were gradually ascending. The way was lengthened by detours around the obstacles which could not be directly surmounted. Sometimes, too, deep crevasses yawned across the ascent, and compelled them to return upon their track for a long distance, before they could find an available pathway. At noon, when the little company halted to dine at the foot of a great clump of firs, at whose foot babbled a tiny brook, they were still halfway from the first plateau, and could hardly reach it before nightfall. From this point the sea stretched broad beneath their feet, but on the right their vision was arrested by the sharp promontory of the southeast, which left them in doubt whether there was land beyond. On the left they could see directly north for several miles, but the northwest was concealed from them by the crest of a fantastic spur, which formed a massive abutment to the central cone. They could, therefore, make no approach as yet to the solving of the great question. At 1 o'clock, the ascent was again begun. The easiest route slanted upwards towards the southwest, through the thick copse. There, under the trees, were flying about a number of gallinaceae of the pheasant family. These were tragopans, adorned with a sort of fleshy wattles hanging over their necks and with two little cylindrical horns behind their eyes. Of these birds, which were about the size of a hen, the female was invariably brown, while the male was resplendent in a coat of red, with little spots of white. With a well-aimed stone spillet killed one of the tragopans, which the hungry Pencroff looked at with longing eyes. Leaving the copse, the climbers, by mounting on each other's shoulders, ascended for 100 feet up a very steep hill, and reached a terrace, almost bare of trees, whose soil was evidently volcanic. From hence, their course was a zigzag towards the east, for the declivity was so steep that they had to take every point of vantage. Neb and Herbert led the way, then came Smith and the reporter. Pencroff was last. The animals who lived among these heights, and whose traces were not wanting, must have the sure foot and the supple spine of a chamois or an izzard. They saw some to whom Pencroff gave a name of his own, sheep, he cried. They all had stopped 50 feet from half a dozen large animals, with thick horns curved backwards and flattened at the end, and with woolly fleece, hidden under long silky fawn-colored hair. They were not the common sheep, but a species widely distributed through the mountainous regions of the temperate zone. Their name, according to Herbert, was mouflon. "Have they legs and chops?" asked the sailor. "Yes," replied Herbert. "Then they're sheep," said Pencroff. The animals stood motionless and astonished at their first sight of man. Then, seized with sudden fear, they fled, leaping away among the rocks. "Goodbye till next time," cried Pencroff to them, in a tone so comical that the others could not forbear laughing. As the ascension continued, the traces of lava were more frequent, and little sulfur springs intercepted their route. At some points sulfur had been deposited in crystals, in the midst of the sand and whitish cinders of feldspar which generally precede the eruption of lava. As they neared the first plateau, formed by the truncation of the lower cone, the ascent became very difficult. By 4 o'clock the last belt of trees had been passed. Here and there stood a few dwarfed and distorted pines, which had survived the attacks of the furious winds. Fortunately for the engineer and his party, it was a pleasant, mild day, for a high wind, at that altitude of 3,000 feet, would have interfered with them sadly. The sky overhead was extremely bright and clear. A perfect calm reigned around them. The sun was hidden by the upper mountain, which cast its shadow, like a vast screen, westward to the edge of the sea. A thin haze began to appear in the east, colored with all the rays of the solar spectrum. There were only 500 feet between the explorers and the plateau where they meant to encamp for the night, but these 500 were increased to 2,000 and more by the tortuous route. The ground, so to speak, gave way under their feet. The angle of ascent was often so obtuse that they slipped upon the smooth worn lava. Little by little the evening set in, and it was almost night when the party, tired out by a 7 hours' climb, arrived at the top of the first cone. Now they must pitch their camp, and think of supper and sleep. The upper terrace of the mountain rose upon a base of rocks, amid which they could soon find a shelter. Firewood was not plenty, yet the moss and dry thistles, so abundant on the plateau, would serve their turn. The sailor built up a fireplace with huge stones, while Neb and Herbert went after the combustibles. They soon came back with a load of thistles, and with flint and steel, the charred linen for tinder, and Neb to blow the fire. A bright blaze was soon sparkling behind the rocks. It was for warmth only, for they kept the pheasant for the next day, and supped off the rest of the cabai and a few dozen pistachio nuts. It was only 6:30 when the meal was ended. Cyrus Smith resolved to explore, in the semi-obscurity, the great circular pediment which upheld the topmost cone of the mountain. Before taking rest, he was anxious to know whether the base of the cone could be passed, in case its flanks should prove too steep for ascent. So, regardless of fatigue, he left Pencroff and Neb to make the sleeping arrangements, and Spilett to note down the incidents of the day, and taking Herbert with him, began to walk around the base of the plateau towards the north. The night was beautiful and still, and not yet very dark. They walked together in silence. Sometimes the plateau was wide and easy, sometimes so encumbered with rubbish that the two could not walk abreast. Finally, after 20 minutes' tramp, they were brought to a halt. From this point the slant of the two cones was equal. To walk around the mountain upon an acclivity whose angle was nearly 75 degrees was impossible. But though they had to give up their flank movement, the chance of a direct ascent was suddenly offered to them. Before them opened an immense chasm in the solid rock. It was the mouth of the upper crater, the gullet, so to speak, through which, when the volcano was active, the eruption took place. Inside, hardened lava and scoriae formed a sort of natural staircase with enormous steps, by which they might possibly reach the summit. Smith saw the opportunity at a glance, and followed by the boy, he walked unhesitatingly into the huge crevasse, in the midst of the gathering darkness. There were yet 1,000 feet to climb. Could they scale the interior wall of the crater? They would try, at all events. Fortunately, the long and sinuous declivities described a winding staircase, and greatly helped their ascent. The crater was evidently exhausted. Not a puff of smoke, not a glimmer of fire, escaped, not a sound or motion in the dark abyss, reaching down, perhaps, to the center of the globe. The air within retained no taint of sulfur. The volcano was not only quiet, but extinct. Evidently the attempt was to succeed. Gradually, as the two mounted the inner walls, they saw the crater grow larger over their heads. The light from the outer sky visibly increased. At each step, so to speak, which they made, new stars entered the field of their vision. The magnificent constellations of the southern sky shone resplendent. In the zenith glittered the splendid Antares of the Scorpion, and not far off that Beta of the Centaur, which is believed to be the nearest star to our terrestrial globe. Then, as the crater opened, appeared Fomalhaut of the Fish, the Triangle, and at last, almost at the Antarctic pole, the glowing Southern Cross. It was nearly 8 o'clock when they set foot on the summit of the cone. The darkness was by this time complete, and they could hardly see a couple of miles around them. Was the land an island, or the eastern extremity of a continent? They could not yet discover. Towards the west a band of cloud, clearly defined against the horizon, deepened the obscurity, and confounded sea with sky. But at one point of the horizon suddenly appeared a vague light, which slowly sank as the clouds mounted to the zenith. It was the slender crescent of the moon, just about to disappear, but the line of the horizon was now cloudless, and as the moon touched it, the engineer could see her face mirrored for an instant on a liquid surface. He seized the boy's hand. "An island," said he, as the lunar crescent disappeared behind the waves.